He was hailed by the Catholic Church as a blessed peacemaker, a devout man of faith who desperately tried to stop the slaughter of the First World War. Yet he was branded a traitor by his allies, dismissed as an incompetent fool by his enemies, presided over the death of a 600-year-old dynasty, and died in penniless exile. His name was Karl I, the last Emperor of Austria-Hungary. How could a man who tried so desperately to save his empire become the very monarch who lost it forever? For nearly 70 years before Karl's ascension, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was personified by one man, Emperor Franz Joseph I. He wasn't so much a ruler as he was an institution, a living monument to a bygone era. Ascending to the throne in the revolutionary year of 1848, he had seen it all. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had seen the map of Europe redrawn time and again. He was the quintessential old world monarch, a man for whom duty, tradition, and protocol were the holy trinity of existence. His daily life was a testament to this unwavering rigidity. He would wake before dawn, work for hours at his simple iron military cot and desk, meticulously reading and signing state papers. He called himself the first servant of the state, and he meant it literally. The Habsburg Palace in Vienna, under his reign, was less a vibrant court and more a gilded government office, suffocated by the infamous Spanish court etiquette, a rigid set of rules dictating every bow, every greeting, every moment of public life. It was a system designed to elevate the monarch to a semi-divine status, but in Franz Joseph's case, it also insulated him from the rapidly changing world outside his palace walls. And what a world it was! The Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the dual monarchy as it was known after the Compromise of 1867, was a paradox. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic tapestry stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, encompassing over 50 million people and at least a dozen distinct nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians. It was held together by three things: the crown, the army, and the bureaucracy. But beneath this veneer of imperial unity, it was a cauldron of simmering resentments. Nationalists called it the Völkerkerker, the prison of nations. The Germans in Vienna worried about the rising influence of the Slavs. The Hungarians, having secured near equal status for themselves, fiercely oppressed the minorities within their own half of the kingdom. The Czechs in Bohemia agitated for their own autonomy, while in the south, the Serbs and Croats dreamed of a unified South Slavic state, a dream actively encouraged by the neighboring kingdom of Serbia. Yet at the same time, this empire on the verge of implosion was a cradle of modern culture. It was a city shaped by the intellectual and artistic revolutions of figures like Sigmund Freud, who was plumbing the depths of the human subconscious just a stone's throw from the imperial palace. It was the Vienna of Gustav Klimt, whose sensual golden paintings scandalized the conservative establishment. It was the city of Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg, composers who were shattering the rules of classical music. It was a city of intellectual ferment and artistic revolution, a place where the modern world was being born. This dazzling cultural brilliance, however, only served to mask the deep political sickness that was eating away at the empire's foundations. It was a beautiful, ornate facade, but the structure behind it was rotten to the core. Franz Joseph, a man of the 19th century, was ill-equipped to handle the passions of the 20th. His long reign had also been marked by immense personal tragedy, hardening him into a figure of profound, stoic sorrow. His brother Maximilian had been executed by a firing squad in Mexico after a disastrous attempt to install him as emperor. His only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, a sensitive and intelligent liberal, had died in a mysterious murder-suicide pact with his young mistress at the Mayerling hunting lodge in 1889. This event didn't just break Franz Joseph's heart, it altered the course of Habsburg history. Then, in 1898, his beautiful, reclusive, and beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, the legendary Sisi, was assassinated, stabbed through the heart by an Italian anarchist. Franz Joseph met each new blow with the same stoic refrain. "You do not know how much I love this woman," he would say of his wife, before returning almost immediately to his desk and his endless piles of state papers. Duty was his only refuge. He had outlived his wife, his son, his brother, and his own era. He was a lonely, tragic figure, the embodiment of an empire that was growing old and tired, just like him. Rudolf's death at Mayerling meant the line of succession had to pass to Franz Joseph's younger brother, Karl Ludwig, and then to his sons. The eldest, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was now the heir to the throne, and he was a very different man from his ancient uncle. Franz Ferdinand was intelligent, strong-willed, famously short-tempered, and deeply conservative in many ways, yet surprisingly reform-minded in others. He saw the rot in the empire's structure. He understood that the dualist German-Hungarian system was unsustainable and was alienating the vast Slavic populations. He floated radical ideas like trialism, which would have created a third South Slavic crown within the empire, giving Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes a level of autonomy similar to that of the Hungarians. This, he hoped, would neutralize the threat from Serbia and placate his Slavic subjects. It was a bold idea, and it made him powerful enemies, particularly among the fiercely nationalistic Hungarian elite who stood to lose the most. Franz Ferdinand's private life was just as defiant. He fell deeply in love with a Czech countess, Sophie Chotek, who, despite her noble birth, was not considered of equal rank to the Habsburgs. According to the strict house laws, she was ineligible to be empress or for their children to inherit the throne. Franz Joseph was aghast and forbade the marriage, but Franz Ferdinand, stubborn and deeply in love, refused to back down. He threatened to renounce his claim to the throne. Eventually, a compromise was reached. He could marry Sophie, but it would be a morganatic marriage. She would never be empress, their children would have no rights of succession, and she would be forced to endure constant public humiliation, always walking behind even the most junior archduchesses at court functions. It was a cruel bargain, but one they accepted for love. This struggle only served to isolate Franz Ferdinand further from the stiff Viennese court and his aging uncle. He and Sophie created their own happy family life, a warm and loving home that stood in stark contrast to the cold formality of the Hofburg. This is where our story's protagonist enters the picture. With Franz Ferdinand's children barred from the throne, the next in line was his younger brother, the notoriously dissolute and scandal-plagued Archduke Otto. But Otto died young of syphilis in 1906, and so the line of succession fell to Otto's eldest son, a quiet, serious, and deeply religious young man named Karl. Archduke Karl Franz Joseph was, in almost every way, the opposite of what one might expect from a future Habsburg emperor. He was not raised with the expectation of one day ruling. That destiny belonged to his uncle, Franz Ferdinand. As such, his upbringing was far less pressured and much more normal than that of a direct heir. He grew up away from the suffocating atmosphere of the Viennese court, developing a gentle, approachable, and unpretentious character. He was known for his kindness, his sincerity, and his profound Catholic faith, which would guide his actions for the rest of his life. He pursued a career in the army, not as a ceremonial officer, but as a genuine soldier. He served with dragoon regiments in Bohemia and Galicia, living in modest barracks, eating with his fellow officers, and developing a real understanding of the common soldiers who made up the bulk of the imperial army. This experience gave him a perspective that few Habsburgs ever had. He saw the diversity of his future empire not as a political problem, but as a human reality. He spoke their languages, he knew their concerns, and he felt a genuine affection for them. This connection to the common man would later inform his desperate attempts to end the war that was consuming them. In 1911, Karl's life took a decisive turn. He married Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma. It was, by all accounts, a genuine love match, a partnership of shared faith, values, and devotion. Zita was no mere consort. She was intelligent, cultured, strong-willed, and politically astute. She came from a large and ancient royal family with connections across Europe, and she brought with her a broader, more international perspective. Together, they represented a new generation of royalty, a modern, devout, and devoted family. The old Emperor Franz Joseph was immensely pleased. In Karl and Zita and their growing brood of children, he finally saw a stable, reliable future for the dynasty. For a few short years, it seemed as though the House of Habsburg had found its footing. Karl, now second in line to the throne after Franz Ferdinand, settled into a life of quiet domesticity and military duty, expecting to wait for decades before the crown would pass to him. History, however, had other plans. The date is June 28, 1914. It is a day heavy with symbolism. For Serbs, it is Vidovdan, or St. Vitus's Day, a national holiday commemorating the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a glorious defeat that became a cornerstone of Serbian national identity. For the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, it is the anniversary of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's morganatic oath, the day they swore away their children's future for the right to marry. It is on this day that the heir to the throne has chosen to visit Sarajevo, the capital of the recently annexed province of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The visit was a calculated risk. Bosnia was a hotbed of South Slavic nationalism, and Franz Ferdinand, the architect of the hated trialism policy, was seen by Serbian radicals as a mortal enemy. Security was shockingly lax. The Archduke and his wife were to travel through the city in an open-topped car, a slow-moving target for any would-be assassin. Along their route, a group of young, tuberculosis-ridden Bosnian Serb nationalists, trained and armed by a shadowy Serbian secret society known as the Black Hand, lay in wait. The day began with a near miss. As the motorcade passed, one of the conspirators threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded-back roof and exploded under the car behind, injuring several officers. The would-be assassin swallowed a faulty cyanide pill and was promptly arrested. Franz Ferdinand was shaken but characteristically composed. He insisted on continuing with the day's schedule, first attending a reception at City Hall, where he angrily admonished the mayor, "I come here as your guest, and you people greet me with bombs." After the reception, a fateful decision was made. Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the officers who had been wounded in the bombing at the hospital. His entourage decided to alter the planned route to avoid the crowded city center. Tragically, nobody remembered to inform the driver of the Archduke's car. As the motorcade proceeded along the Appel Quay, the driver made the scheduled right turn onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original route. An officer shouted at him, "This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." The driver stopped the car and began to slowly back up. It was in that exact moment, at that exact spot, that another of the assassins, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing. He had given up hope after the first failed attempt and had gone to a nearby delicatessen. Seeing the car stall right in front of him, he seized his chance. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and from a distance of no more than 5 feet, fired 2 shots. The first struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. At first, No one seemed to realize the severity of what had happened. Sophie collapsed onto her husband's lap. Franz Ferdinand, still upright, was heard to beg her, "Soferl! Soferl! Don't die! Live for our children!" Then, as an aide asked if he was in pain, he managed to whisper, "It is nothing," before a torrent of blood poured from his mouth and he slumped over, dead. Sophie died moments later. The 2 shots fired by a teenage nationalist on a Sarajevo street corner had not only killed an archduke and his wife, they had just set the world on fire. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand triggered a diplomatic crisis that spiraled out of control with terrifying speed. In Vienna, the War Party, a powerful faction of generals and politicians who had long advocated for a preemptive war to crush Serbia, saw their chance. They persuaded the aging, grief-stricken Emperor Franz Joseph that the nation's honor demanded a military response. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so harsh they were deliberately designed to be rejected. Behind Vienna stood its powerful ally, Germany, which issued the infamous blank check, promising unconditional support for any action Austria took. Across Europe, the continent's intricate and fragile system of alliances kicked into gear like a doomsday machine. When Serbia, backed by Russia, rejected parts of the ultimatum, Austria-Hungary declared war. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of the Slavs, began to mobilize its massive army. This triggered Germany to declare war on Russia. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required a rapid knockout blow against Russia's ally, France, which meant invading through neutral Belgium. The invasion of Belgium brought the British Empire, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, into the war. Within 5 weeks, a regional Balkan conflict had erupted into a full-blown continental war. The Great War had begun. For Archduke Karl, the news from Sarajevo was a personal and political earthquake. He had been fond of his uncle, and now suddenly, at the age of 26, he was the heir apparent to a 600-year-old throne. The weight of the dynasty, the empire, and the future now rested squarely on his young shoulders. He was summoned by Franz Joseph, who reportedly told him, "God's will be done. The Almighty does not allow himself to be challenged." In the summer of 1914, no one anticipated the horror that was to come. The prevailing belief across Europe was that the war would be a short, glorious affair, over by Christmas. Patriotic fervor swept through the capitals, but the dream of a swift victory soon died in the mud and blood of the trenches. The war became a brutal, grinding stalemate, a conflict of unprecedented scale and savagery. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the war was a disaster from the outset. Its army, though vast, was ill-equipped, poorly led, and plagued by the internal ethnic divisions of the empire itself. Early invasions of Serbia were repulsed with humiliating losses. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army inflicted staggering casualties and pushed deep into Austrian territory in Galicia. In 1915, Italy, once a nominal ally, betrayed the Central Powers and entered the war on the side of the Entente, opening up a new, brutal front in the Alps. Karl, as the heir, served on the front lines, first on the Eastern Front and later on the Italian front. He was not a brilliant strategist, but he was a competent and compassionate commander. More importantly, he saw the reality of the war firsthand. He saw the death, the suffering, the sheer, pointless waste of it all. He saw his soldiers, men from every corner of his future empire, dying in their hundreds of thousands for a cause that was becoming increasingly unclear. This experience seared itself into his soul. It filled him with a profound horror of war and a deep conviction that it had to be stopped. By the winter of 1916, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was bleeding to death. It had suffered millions of casualties. The Allied naval blockade was causing severe food and fuel shortages on the home front. People were starving in the cities. The initial patriotic unity had evaporated, replaced by war weariness, dissent, and a resurgence of the old nationalist tensions. The empire was cracking under the strain, and in the Hofburg Palace, the old emperor was finally dying. On November 21, 1916, after a reign of 68 years, Franz Joseph I passed away at the age of 86. The man who had been the single, unifying symbol of the empire for as long as anyone could remember was gone. As his body lay in state, an era officially came to an end. The crown now passed to his great-nephew, the 29-year-old Archduke Karl. He was now Emperor Karl I of Austria and Apostolic King Karl IV of Hungary. He had inherited a throne, an empire, and a war that was already lost. The stage was set for the final tragic act of the Habsburg saga. On a bitterly cold day in December 1916, in the Great Matthias Church in Budapest, Karl was crowned Apostolic King of Hungary. The ceremony was a piece of medieval theater, a ritual steeped in 1,000 years of history. He swore the ancient oath, sword in hand, pledging to defend the kingdom's borders. It was a spectacle designed to project an image of continuity, stability, and divine right. But it was a hollow performance. The cheering crowds in Budapest could not drown out the sound of artillery fire on the distant fronts. The sacred crown could not hide the fact that the kingdom he now swore to protect was starving and on the verge of collapse. Karl was now the ruler of a dying empire, and unlike his aged predecessor, who had become resigned to the war's grim logic, Karl was determined to stop it. This wasn't just a political calculation for him, it was a profound moral and religious imperative. As a devout Catholic, he saw the continued slaughter as a monstrous sin. As a former frontline soldier, he knew the human cost in a way that the generals and politicians in Vienna and Berlin never could. And as a young husband and father, he felt a deep personal responsibility for the suffering of the families torn apart by the conflict. He famously told a confidant, "It is the duty of a sovereign to ensure the well-being of his people. If he is unable to do so, he must go." This was the principle that would guide his brief, tragic reign. From the moment he ascended the throne, Karl's single, overriding obsession was peace. He knew with absolute clarity that the war was unwinnable and that every additional day of fighting brought his empire closer to total disintegration. But how to achieve it? The situation seemed hopeless. Austria-Hungary was inextricably shackled to its senior partner, Imperial Germany. The German High Command, now effectively a military dictatorship under Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, was committed to total victory. They were gambling everything on a final decisive push, and they would not tolerate any talk of a negotiated settlement from their wavering Austrian ally. On the other side, the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, were equally committed to victory, especially now that they smelled blood in the water. They saw Austria-Hungary as the sick man of Europe, a crumbling anachronism that needed to be dismantled. A separate peace with Vienna held little appeal when the complete destruction of the Central Powers seemed within their grasp. Karl was trapped. A public peace offer would be instantly vetoed by Germany and likely dismissed by the Allies. Any attempt to break away from Germany unilaterally would be seen as treason and could even provoke a German invasion of Austria. His only option was to act in secret, to open a clandestine channel to the enemy, to try and untangle the knot of war from the inside. It was an incredibly dangerous gamble, one that would require immense courage, subtlety, and a great deal of luck. The key to Karl's secret peace plan was his wife, the Empress Zita. Zita's family, the House of Bourbon-Parma, was a sprawling European dynasty with relatives on both sides of the conflict. Her two brothers, Prince Sixtus and Prince Xavier, were paradoxically serving as officers in the Belgian army, fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This unique family connection provided the perfect confidential channel. Sixtus and Xavier were fiercely loyal to their sister and her husband, but they were also patriotic citizens of the Allied nations. They were the ideal intermediaries, men who could be trusted by both sides. In early 1917, through a series of secret messages relayed through Zita's mother in neutral Switzerland, Karl made contact with his brothers-in-law. He invited them to a top-secret meeting at his palace at Laxenburg, just outside Vienna. The risks were enormous. If their presence were discovered, Sixtus and Xavier would be shot as spies. Karl himself would be accused of treason by his German allies. The meeting was conducted in the dead of night, with the two princes smuggled into the palace like thieves. There, in the quiet of his study, Emperor Karl laid out his proposal. He was not a man given to grand pronouncements. He was direct, sincere, and desperate. He spoke not as an emperor demanding terms, but as a man pleading for an end to the madness. His offer was astonishingly generous. He proposed that Austria-Hungary would champion the restoration of Belgium's sovereignty. He agreed that Alsace-Lorraine, the territory annexed by Germany from France in 1871 and a major point of contention, should be returned to France. He offered the restoration of Serbia with guaranteed access to the sea. In essence, he was conceding almost every major Allied war aim in the West. In return, he asked for the preservation of his own empire, perhaps with some minor territorial adjustments in Italy's favor. To prove his sincerity, Karl handwrote a letter outlining these proposals. It was a deeply personal and incredibly risky document. It began, "My dear Sixtus, the end of the third year of this war, which has brought so much mourning and grief into the world, is approaching. All the peoples of my empire are more closely united than ever in the common determination to safeguard the integrity of the monarchy, even at the cost of the heaviest sacrifices." He went on to detail his peace terms, concluding with a plea for secrecy and help. He entrusted this explosive letter to Sixtus, who was to present it personally to the French president, Raymond Poincaré. This secret initiative became known as the Sixtus Affair. For a few hopeful weeks in the spring of 1917, it seemed as if peace might just be possible. Sixtus and Xavier shuttled between Vienna, Paris, and London, acting as the emperor's secret envoys. The initial reception from the French was cautiously positive. President Poincaré and the new Prime Minister, Aristide Briand, were intrigued. They saw the potential to detach Austria-Hungary from Germany, which would effectively end the war. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was also receptive. He famously remarked that the letter was a very important communication and that we must not let this opportunity slip. But the glimmer of hope was quickly extinguished. The Sixtus affair was derailed by a combination of bad luck, diplomatic intransigence, and the rapidly changing strategic landscape of the war. Just as negotiations were gaining momentum, two momentous events occurred. In Russia, the February Revolution toppled the Tsar, and while the new provisional government vowed to continue the war, the Russian army was beginning to disintegrate. This freed up huge numbers of German and Austrian troops to be moved to the Western and Italian fronts. At the same time, Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare finally provoked the United States to declare war in April 1917. The entry of America, with its vast industrial might and fresh manpower, fundamentally changed the balance of power. For the hardliners in Paris and London, the prospect of a total crushing victory now seemed more certain than ever. Why settle for a negotiated peace with Austria when they could wait for America to arrive and win everything. The final nail in the coffin, however, was hammered in by Italy. The Italian government, particularly its stubborn and cynical foreign minister Sidney Sonnino, was adamantly opposed to any separate peace with Austria. Italy had entered the war based on the secret Treaty of London in 1915, which promised it vast swathes of Austrian territory: Trentino, South Tyrol, Istria, and much of the Dalmatian coast. Karl's peace proposal did not offer Italy nearly as much as it had been promised. Sonnino feared, correctly, that if Austria-Hungary survived the war, Italy would not get its spoils. He therefore refused to even consider a negotiated peace and effectively vetoed the entire initiative. The Entente's unity was more important to them than a chance for peace. The window of opportunity slammed shut. Karl's courageous, secret gamble had failed. He did not give up. He tried other avenues, making further secret contacts through intermediaries in Switzerland and Spain, but it was no use. The war machine had a momentum of its own. It would grind on, consuming hundreds of thousands more lives until one side or the other was completely exhausted. For Karl, the failure of his peace initiatives was a devastating blow. He had offered a way out, and the world had refused to take it. He was a man of peace trapped in a world at war, a sovereign who was becoming a prisoner of his own German allies. While Karl was secretly trying to end the war, he was also desperately trying to manage the escalating crisis within his own empire. He was a reform-minded monarch in an empire that was profoundly resistant to reform. His approach to governance was a breath of fresh air after the rigid autocratic style of Franz Joseph, but it was perhaps too little, too late. One of his first acts was to recall the Reichsrat, the Austrian parliament, which had been suspended since the start of the war. This was a bold move intended to give a voice to the empire's restless nationalities and to create a forum for political debate. But instead of fostering unity, the reconvened parliament immediately became a battleground for nationalist grievances. Czech, Polish, and South Slav deputies used their newfound freedom to openly demand autonomy or even independence. The very institution Karl had hoped would save the empire became a stage for its public dissection. He also launched an ambitious program of social reforms, something unheard of for a Habsburg monarch. He created a ministry of social welfare, the first of its kind in the world. He introduced legislation to protect tenants from eviction, to provide aid to war widows and orphans, and to establish unemployment benefits. He tried to limit the power of the often brutal military authorities who had taken control of the civilian administration. He was particularly concerned with the plight of the common people who were bearing the brunt of the war's hardships. There are numerous accounts of him stopping his car to speak with ordinary citizens, listening to their complaints, and trying to offer help. He was a monarch who genuinely cared, but his empire was now a house on fire, and he was trying to put it out with a teacup. The greatest problem was hunger. The Allied blockade, combined with a poor harvest and the inefficiencies of the empire's administration, had created a catastrophic food crisis. By 1917, the people of Vienna were living on starvation rations. The official daily allowance was less than 900 calories. People were eating bread made with sawdust and turnips instead of potatoes. The famous Viennese coffee houses served a vile brew made from roasted acorns. Disease was rampant. The death rate from tuberculosis skyrocketed. This widespread misery created a fertile ground for social unrest. Strikes and food riots became commonplace. The socialist and nationalist movements, once on the fringe, were gaining mass support. The people's age-old loyalty to the Habsburg dynasty was wearing dangerously thin. Karl's relationship with his own government was also fraught with difficulty. He dismissed many of the old conservative ministers he had inherited from Franz Joseph, replacing them with men he hoped would be more open to peace and reform. but he struggled to find capable allies. His attempts to reach a political settlement with the empire's Slavic peoples were constantly sabotaged by the hardline German, Austrian, and Hungarian establishments who refused to relinquish their privileged positions. In Hungary in particular, the powerful Magyar aristocracy, led by Prime Minister István Tisza, blocked every attempt at reform, jealously guarding their dominance over the kingdom's Slovak, Romanian, and Croat minorities. Karl was an emperor who wanted to be a federator, a unifier, but he was surrounded by nationalists who wanted to tear the empire apart for their own gain. And always, looming over everything, was the shadow of Germany. As Austria-Hungary weakened, its dependence on its powerful ally grew. The German High Command increasingly treated the Austro-Hungarian army as a mere auxiliary force. In 1917, the two armies were placed under a unified German command structure, effectively ending Austria's military independence. Karl bitterly resented this. He had a personal dislike for the arrogant Prussian militarism embodied by men like Ludendorff, and he saw that Germany's expansionist war aims were dragging his own empire to its doom. The final public humiliation came in the spring of 1918. The new Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, Count Ottokar Czernin, gave a speech in which he foolishly boasted of having been approached by France with peace feelers. This infuriated the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, a fierce nationalist known as the Tiger. Clemenceau, who had known about the Sixtus affair all along, saw his chance to drive a wedge between Austria and Germany and to humiliate the young emperor. He did something unprecedented in the history of diplomacy. He published the secret letter Karl had written to Prince Sixtus a year earlier. The revelation was a political bombshell. Karl was exposed to the world and to his German allies as having tried to betray them. The Germans were furious. Ludendorff demanded an explanation. For a moment, it seemed as if Germany might even invade Austria. Trapped and utterly humiliated, Karl had no choice but to deny everything. He was forced to send a telegram to the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, assuring him of his unshakable fidelity and calling Clemenceau's revelations a lie. He then had to travel to the German military headquarters at Spa, a trip that was less a visit between allies and more a summons to a vassal. There, he was forced to sign agreements that effectively made Austria-Hungary a political, military, and economic satellite of Germany. It was his Canossa. The emperor who had tried to save his empire's independence had been forced to sign it away. The Sixtus affair, his greatest hope for peace, had ended in his complete and utter subjugation. The last vestiges of Habsburg sovereignty were gone. Karl was now a king in name only. The spring of 1918 was the season of the last gamble. With Russia out of the war and American troops still arriving in force, the German High Command saw one final narrow window to win the war on the Western Front. They unleashed Operation Michael, the spring offensive, a series of massive, ferocious attacks designed to shatter the Allied lines and capture Paris before the Americans could make a difference. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed as if they might succeed. The German army surged forward, inflicting enormous casualties and creating a deep salient in the Allied front. Pressured by their German masters, the Austro-Hungarian High Command was ordered to launch its own decisive offensive on the Italian front to tie down Allied forces and prevent them from reinforcing France. Emperor Karl was deeply opposed to the plan. He had toured the front lines. He knew his army was at the breaking point. His soldiers were underfed, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Many were dressed in rags, their boots held together with wire. The Spanish flu was beginning to ravage the ranks. Launching a major offensive with this ghost of an army was not just a strategic risk, it was suicidal. He pleaded with his generals to reconsider, but the pressure from Germany was immense, and his own commanders, desperate for a final redeeming victory, were deaf to his warnings. The attack, known as the Battle of the Piave River, was launched in June 1918. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. The Italian army, having recovered from its devastating defeat at Caporetto the previous year, was well prepared and fought with grim determination. The Austro-Hungarian offensive stalled almost immediately. Soldiers who managed to cross the Piave River found themselves trapped, with their supply lines cut by the swollen river and relentless Italian artillery fire. Within days, the attack collapsed into a bloody, chaotic retreat. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered over 150,000 casualties in the Battle of the Piave, but the true cost was far greater. This defeat shattered the army's last vestiges of morale and cohesion. It was the army, the Imperial and Royal Army, that had always been one of the three pillars holding the multi-ethnic empire together. It was the one institution where Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, and Croats served side by side, bound by a common oath to the emperor. Now, that pillar had crumbled. The soldiers began to desert in droves, not as individuals, but in entire units, often organized along ethnic lines. They simply packed their bags, took their rifles, and started walking home. The Imperial and Royal Army was dissolving, melting away like snow in the spring. Karl's worst fears had been realized. The last instrument of Habsburg power had broken in his hands. While the army was disintegrating on the front lines, the empire was imploding from within. The revelation of the Sixtus affair had been the final straw for the empire's long-suffering Slavic peoples. It proved to them that the emperor, for all his good intentions, was a prisoner of Germany, and that no meaningful reform or autonomy could ever be expected from Vienna. Their leaders, many of whom were living in exile in Paris and London, now abandoned any thought of reforming the monarchy. Their goal was now total independence, and the Allies, sensing the final collapse, were now ready to listen. Throughout 1918, they systematically granted official recognition to the various nationalist committees. The Czechoslovak National Council, led by the philosopher-statesman Tomáš Masaryk, was recognized as the de facto government of a future Czech and Slovak state. The Yugoslav Committee was acknowledged as the representative of the South Slavs. The Polish cause was championed by President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. In his famous 14-point speech, a blueprint for the post-war world, Wilson had explicitly called for the freest opportunity for autonomous development for the peoples of Austria-Hungary. At first, this was interpreted as a call for federalism within the empire. But as the war progressed, it became a clear endorsement of complete independence. The Allies were no longer interested in a separate peace with Karl. They were actively presiding over the liquidation of his empire. The Völkerkerker, the prison of nations, was being dismantled brick by its own inmates, with the full support of the jailer's enemies. By the autumn of 1918, the end came with breathtaking speed. The Allied armies, now massively reinforced by the Americans, launched a counteroffensive on the Western Front that sent the exhausted German army reeling. In the Balkans, a combined Allied force launched an attack from Greece, knocking Bulgaria out of the war in late September. This severed the land route between the Central Powers and the Ottoman Empire, which capitulated a month later. For Austria-Hungary, the Bulgarian collapse was a fatal blow. The Balkan front, which had been quiet for years, was now wide open. Allied forces were poised to march up the Danube Valley, directly towards Budapest and Vienna. On the Italian front, the Italian army, sensing the moment of final victory, launched a massive offensive at the end of October. In the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, they smashed through the Austrian lines. The Austro-Hungarian army, now little more than a disorganized mob of men desperate to go home, completely disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands were taken prisoner without a fight. The long, bloody war in the Alps was over. The Habsburg Empire no longer had an army to defend it. In his palace at Schönbrunn, Emperor Karl watched as his world fell apart. He was now an emperor with no empire, a commander-in-chief with no army. He was utterly alone. The German-Austrian elite who had run the empire for centuries were powerless. The Hungarian government was concerned only with preserving its own territory and was preparing to sever all ties with Vienna. The Slavic peoples were openly declaring their independence. On October 28th, Prague declared the birth of Czechoslovakia. A day later, Zagreb announced the creation of the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which would soon merge into the new kingdom of Yugoslavia. In Krakow, the Poles were taking control, preparing to join the resurrected Polish state. In a last, desperate attempt to hold on to something, to salvage some remnant of his inheritance, Karl played his final card. On October 16th, he issued what became known as the Völker Manifest, the People's Manifesto. It was a revolutionary document for a Habsburg monarch. It declared that the Austrian half of the empire was to be transformed into a federal state, a union of 4 national components: German, Czech, South Slav, and Ukrainian. Each would have its own national council and complete autonomy. It was the very idea that Archduke Franz Ferdinand had championed and been assassinated for, the idea that Karl himself had believed in. It was a plan that, had it been proposed 4 years or even 2 years earlier, might have saved the monarchy. But in the chaos of October 1918, it was a meaningless gesture. The time for federalism was long past. The empire's peoples no longer wanted autonomy within the empire. They wanted complete freedom from it. In a final tragic irony, the various national groups simply ignored the manifesto's federalist intent and seized upon the emperor's words as a legal justification for their secession. Karl had officially sanctioned the creation of national councils, and those councils used their new legitimacy to declare his rule null and void. His last attempt to save his empire only accelerated its demise. He had, in effect, signed his own dynasty's death warrant. The final days were surreal. The authority of the central government simply evaporated. In Vienna, a provisional German-Austrian government was formed by the socialist leader Karl Renner, operating in parallel to the emperor's now powerless imperial ministry. The streets were filled with revolutionary fervor. Red flags began to appear. There was talk of a Bolshevik-style uprising. The once mighty Habsburg monarchy, which had dominated Central Europe for more than 6 centuries, was reduced to a single man and his family, isolated in a vast, empty palace surrounded by the debris of their fallen world. By the beginning of November, the war was effectively over. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice with the Italians. The terms amounted to unconditional surrender. For Karl, there was one last painful duty to perform. The new German-Austrian government demanded his abdication. They wanted a clean break with the past, the formal end of the monarchy. But for Karl, abdication was an impossibility. It was a matter of deep religious conscience. At his coronation, he had sworn a sacred oath to God to rule his peoples. In his mind, this was a sacrament, a bond that no political development could break. To abdicate would be to commit perjury before God. It was a line he would not cross. After days of agonizing negotiation, a compromise was found. Karl would not abdicate. Instead, he would issue a proclamation in which he would renounce every participation in the administration of the state. He would release his ministers and officials from their oath of loyalty to him, allowing them to serve the new state without conflict of conscience. But he would not and could not renounce the throne itself. In his heart and before God, he would remain the rightful emperor. It was a subtle but crucial distinction, one that would shape the rest of his life and his tragic attempts to reclaim what he had lost. On November 11th, 1918, the very same day the armistice was signed on the Western Front, officially ending the Great War, Karl signed the proclamation at Schönbrunn. His last official act was to anoint his prime minister as his successor, a final futile gesture of legitimate transition. That evening, as darkness fell over Vienna, Karl, Zita, and their young children walked out of the imperial palace for the last time. There was no grand ceremony, no final review of the guard, just a quiet, sad departure. A small crowd had gathered outside. Some were hostile, some were curious, but many were old loyalists who had come to see their emperor one last time. As the cars pulled away, shouts of "Long live the Emperor!" could be heard, a final faint echo of a world that no longer existed. They drove to their hunting lodge at Exile, a modest estate outside the city. The next day, on November 12, 1918, the Provisional National Assembly in Vienna formally proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of German Austria. After over 600 years, Habsburg rule was over. The last emperor was now a private citizen in a country that no longer wanted him. But for Karl, the story was not over. In his mind, this was not an end, but an interregnum. He was a king in waiting, a sovereign in exile in his own land, biding his time until God and his people called him back. The tragedy of his reign was over. The tragedy of his exile was about to begin. For 4 months, the last Emperor of Austria and his family lived in a strange, suspended reality at Exile. They were not prisoners in a formal sense, but they were not free. The hunting lodge, once a pleasant retreat from the burdens of state, had become a gilded cage. Karl was an emperor in exile in his own country, a sovereign with no subjects, a man stripped of everything but his title and his family. The new Republican government in Vienna watched his every move, debating what to do with this living symbol of the old regime. Life at Exile was a surreal blend of the mundane and the monarchical. Empress Zita, ever practical, organized the household, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for their young children, who were largely oblivious to the political earthquake that had shattered their world. Karl spent his days reading, praying, and receiving a trickle of loyalists who made the journey from Vienna to offer their respects. They still addressed him as "Your Majesty." But these small acts of deference could not hide the grim reality. The revolutionary tide was rising. Food was scarce. The political situation was volatile, and the family's safety was far from guaranteed. The government in Vienna, led by the socialist Karl Renner, was in a precarious position. They were trying to build a new republic on the ashes of an old empire, and the presence of the former monarch was a dangerous anachronism. They feared he could become a rallying point for a counter-revolution, so they presented him with an ultimatum, enshrined in a piece of legislation that would become known as the Habsburg Law. The terms were simple and brutal. Karl and his family could remain in Austria as private citizens, but only if he formally abdicated and renounced all claims to the throne for himself and his descendants forever. If he refused, he and his entire family would be banished from Austrian soil for eternity, and their personal property confiscated. For the pragmatic politicians in Vienna, this was a logical, necessary step, but for Karl, it was an unthinkable demand. As we've seen, his refusal to abdicate was not a matter of political pride. It was a matter of sacred oath. He believed he had been anointed by God. To renounce his throne would be to break a covenant, a mortal sin. He could not and would not do it. He told the government emissaries, "A king can be deposed. He can be deprived of his rights by his people. That is a matter of force. But abdicate? Never, never, never." His decision was made. If he could not stay in his homeland as its rightful sovereign, then he would leave it. The government, almost relieved, began to make arrangements for his departure. The question was, where would he go? Most of Europe was closed to him. The victorious Allied powers wanted nothing to do with the deposed Habsburg. It was a British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Liesel Strutt, who was attached to the family as a liaison, who ultimately secured their passage. Strutt, a gruff but honorable soldier, had developed a genuine respect and sympathy for the dignified, tragic family. He used his influence to persuade the British government to allow the family to travel into exile in neutral Switzerland. On the evening of March 23, 1919, Karl and his family left Exile for the last time. They boarded the old imperial court train, a final ghostly relic of their former lives. As the train prepared to cross the border into Switzerland the next morning, it made a stop. Karl asked the train to halt, and he looked out the window one last time at the Austrian fields. Then he drafted a formal protest, the Feldkirch Manifesto. In it, he solemnly declared that his renunciation proclamation of November had been extorted from him by force. He reasserted his sacred rights as the legitimate sovereign and declared that he did not consider himself bound by the revolutionary government's decision. It was a final act of defiance, a declaration that even in exile he would not surrender his claim. As the train crossed the border, a Swiss official boarded and, unsure of the correct protocol, asked for their passports. Zita, with quiet dignity, replied, "Madam, we are a family of Habsburg. We have no need of passports. We have been for 500 years. The official, taken aback, simply bowed and let them pass. They had left their home, their empire, and their history behind them. The emperor was now a refugee. Their new home was the Château de Warteg, a modest castle on the shores of Lake Constance. For the first time in their lives, they were truly on their own, dependent on the dwindling funds they had managed to bring with them and the charity of relatives. But if the new republics of Central Europe thought that by exiling Karl they had neutralized him, they were gravely mistaken. The chateau in Switzerland did not become a place of quiet retirement. It became the headquarters of a government in exile, a nerve center for the monarchist cause. A steady stream of loyalist politicians, army officers, and aristocrats from Austria and Hungary made the pilgrimage to Warteg to pledge their allegiance and to plot the restoration. Karl's focus, however, was not on Austria. The new Austrian Republic, though politically fragile, had a strong anti-monarchist consensus. The real hope, the key to a Habsburg restoration, lay in Hungary. The situation there was completely different. After the collapse of the monarchy, Hungary had descended into chaos. A short-lived liberal republic was overthrown by a brutal communist dictatorship under Béla Kun, which unleashed a Red Terror. This, in turn, was crushed by a counter-revolutionary army, aided by Romanian forces, which then unleashed its own White Terror against communists, Jews, and liberals. Out of this bloody chaos, one man emerged as the dominant figure, Miklos Horthy, a former admiral in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. Horthy was a staunch conservative, an ardent anti-communist, and a Hungarian nationalist. In 1920, he had the Hungarian parliament formally restore the monarchy. But this was a strange, paradoxical restoration. Hungary was declared a kingdom, but it had no king. The parliament elected Horthy to serve as regent, to rule the country in the name of the absent monarch until the political situation allowed for his return. This created an incredibly ambiguous situation. Horthy was ruling as regent for a specific living king, Karl IV of Hungary. He had sworn an oath of allegiance to Karl as an officer in the imperial navy. Many of Horthy's own supporters, the very people who brought him to power, were legitimists, men who believed that Karl was the one and only rightful ruler. From his exile in Switzerland, Karl watched these developments with growing hope. He saw Horthy not as a rival, but as his loyal servant, a regent who was simply keeping the throne warm for him. He believed that all he had to do was return to Hungary, and Horthy, as his loyal subject, would dutifully step aside and hand back power to his anointed king. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation of the man he was dealing with. By the spring of 1921, Karl decided the time was right. His supporters in Hungary were assuring him that the people were ready, that the army would rally to his cause, and that Horthy was only waiting for his king to return. He decided to act, and to act in secret. He knew that the Allied powers and Hungary's nervous neighbors like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, the so-called Little Entente, were terrified of a Habsburg restoration and would do everything in their power to stop it. He had to present them with a fait accompli. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. On Easter weekend, when the diplomats of Europe would be distracted by the holiday, he would travel to Hungary in disguise, confront Horthy in person, and reclaim his throne. It was a gamble based entirely on the element of surprise and his faith in Horthy's personal loyalty. On Thursday, March 24th, he slipped out of his villa, telling Zita he was going for a walk. Only she and a handful of conspirators knew the truth. He traveled to Vienna with a fake Spanish passport, then on to the Hungarian border. He crossed into his former kingdom on foot in the dead of night, and was met by a car driven by a loyalist nobleman. He arrived unannounced at the palace of a sympathetic bishop in western Hungary on Saturday morning. The first phase of his plan had succeeded brilliantly. He was back on Hungarian soil. The news of his arrival spread like wildfire through the legitimist circles. There was jubilation. Prime Minister Paul Teleki, a staunch monarchist, rushed to meet him. Karl's confidence soared. He decided to travel immediately to Budapest to meet with Horthy. On Easter Sunday, he arrived at the royal palace in Buda, the ancient seat of Hungarian kings. He walked in, unannounced, and asked an astonished aide-de-camp to inform the regent that his king had arrived. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confrontations in modern history. In the regent's office, the king and his admiral stood face to face. It was the first time they had met since the collapse of the empire. Karl was calm, confident, and regal. He expected Horthy to click his heels, salute, and hand over power. He began by saying, "I have returned. The time has come for you to transfer power to me." But Miklos Horthy did not salute. He did not step aside. Instead, he began to make excuses. He was visibly shaken, torn between his old oath of loyalty and his current grip on power. But pragmatism and perhaps personal ambition won out. He told Karl that the international situation was too dangerous, that a Habsburg restoration would trigger an immediate military invasion by the Little Entente. He argued that the Hungarian army was too weak to fight, and that Karl's return would plunge the country into a new, bloody war. "This is a disaster," Horthy pleaded. "Your Majesty, I beg of you, please leave at once. Your life is in danger." Karl was stunned. This was not the loyal welcome he had expected. He countered every one of Horthy's arguments. He insisted that the French, at least, had secretly given him their blessing, a claim that was likely a hopeful exaggeration. He argued that his return as the legitimate king was the only thing that could bring true stability to the nation. The argument went back and forth for 2 hours. It was a clash of two worldviews. For Karl, it was a matter of divine right, of sacred duty and legitimacy. For Horthy, it was a matter of realpolitik, of national survival in a hostile world. Finally, Horthy made his position clear. He would not hand over power. He urged Karl to leave the country, promising that he would prepare the ground for a restoration at a later, more opportune moment. Whether he was sincere or simply buying time is a question historians still debate. But for Karl, it was a profound and bitter betrayal. The man he had trusted, his own subject, the regent who ruled in his name, had looked him in the eye and refused him. Defeated and humiliated, Karl had no choice. He had come alone, without an army. He could not force the issue without sparking the very civil war he sought to avoid. He agreed to leave. Horthy, perhaps trying to soften the blow, made a show of respect. He accompanied Karl to the train station, and as the king boarded, Horthy knelt and kissed his hand, a final empty gesture of fealty. As the train pulled away, Karl was heartbroken. His bold, romantic gamble had failed. He had come home to reclaim his kingdom and had been turned away at the gates by his own gatekeeper. The return journey to Switzerland was a long, silent trip into a deeper, more bitter exile. The secret was out. The whole world now knew of his failed attempt. He was no longer just a deposed monarch. He was a political troublemaker, a threat to the fragile peace of post-war Europe. His enemies were now on high alert. But Karl was not a man to be deterred by a single failure. In his mind, the confrontation with Horthy had not been an ending. It had simply clarified the situation. He now knew that Horthy would not step aside willingly. Next time, he would not come alone. Next time, he would come with an army. The first attempt had been a tragedy of misplaced faith. The second would be a final desperate roll of the dice. The failure of the Easter attempt did not extinguish Karl's resolve. It forged it into a harder, more dangerous weapon. The humiliation of being turned away by Horthy, a man he considered his servant, had been a bitter lesson. He now understood that faith and legitimacy were not enough. Power, he realized, did not yield to sentiment. It yielded only to superior power. Back in Switzerland, the Château de Warteg was no longer a court in exile. It was the war room for a second and final attempt to reclaim the throne of Hungary. The driving force behind this new plan was not just Karl, but also the Empress Zita. Pregnant with their 8th child, she was a figure of iron will. She saw the betrayal by Horthy not just as a political setback, but as a profound personal and moral injury. For Zita, the monarchy was not a political system. It was a sacred trust, a divine mandate that had been usurped. She refused to accept a future of quiet, dignified exile. She pushed, she planned, she strategized. Together, she and Karl became a single, determined entity, consumed by one goal, the restoration. Their legitimate supporters in Hungary fed this determination with a constant stream of encouraging and likely exaggerated intelligence. They reported that Horthy's regime was unpopular, that the army was seething with discontent, and that the officer corps was overwhelmingly loyal to their true king. They claimed that entire garrisons were ready to mutiny the moment Karl set foot on Hungarian soil. They promised him that this time he would not arrive to a polite refusal, but to a triumphant military parade. All he needed to do was show himself. The plan they concocted was even more audacious than the first. Secrecy was still paramount. The Allied powers and the Little Entente were watching him like hawks. A journey by train or car was now impossible. They decided to embrace the most modern and most dangerous technology of the age, the airplane. A former Austro-Hungarian Air Force pilot procured a small, rickety Junkers monoplane. It was barely large enough for the pilot, Karl, Zita, and one loyal aide. The plan was to fly from an airfield near Zurich, across Austria in the dead of night, and land in a pre-arranged field in western Hungary where loyalist troops would be waiting. It was a leap of faith into the dark, a final all-or-nothing wager. On October 20th, 1921, they put their plan into action. Under the cover of darkness, Karl and Zita, who was 5 months pregnant, climbed into the cramped, unheated cockpit of the small plane. The flight was a terrifying ordeal. They flew through thick fog and treacherous mountain winds. The plane's engine sputtered, and they were forced to make an emergency landing in a remote field to refuel. For a few heart-stopping hours, it seemed the attempt was doomed before it even began. But they managed to take off again, and on the afternoon of October 21st, they successfully landed in a field near the town of Sopron in western Hungary. They were met by a small, disorganized but enthusiastic force of royalist soldiers led by a group of legitimist officers. The reception was a world away from the lonely arrival at Easter. This was a military operation. Karl immediately donned the uniform of a Hungarian general. He was no longer a petitioner, he was a commander-in-chief returning to lead his army. He began to issue proclamations appointing a new government and calling on all Hungarian soldiers to return to their rightful oath of allegiance. For the next 2 days, it seemed as if the gamble might pay off. They began a slow, triumphal march towards Budapest. The royalist force, which became known as the Royal Army, swelled in size as they progressed. At the major garrison town of Győr, the local commander, after some hesitation, swore allegiance. Other units joined them. They commandeered a train, and the march on Budapest began in earnest. The news of the king's return was spreading across the country. The mood on the royal train was euphoric. Victory seemed within their grasp. They believed that Horthy's regime would simply melt away in the face of this popular and military uprising. In Budapest, the news of Karl's landing and march on the capital hit the government like a thunderclap. Horthy was faced with the ultimate test, but this time there was no hesitation, no ambiguity. He saw Karl's action not as a legitimate attempt to reclaim his throne, but as an act of treason, an armed insurrection that would plunge the country into civil war and guarantee a foreign invasion. The governments of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania were already mobilizing their armies, threatening to occupy Hungary to prevent a Habsburg restoration. Horthy's primary duty, as he saw it, was to the survival of the Hungarian state, even if it meant taking up arms against the man he still, in some part of his soul, considered his king. He acted with ruthless efficiency. He declared Karl a traitor. He imposed martial law. He delivered a fiery speech to his officers, releasing them from their old oath to the king and demanding a new oath of loyalty to himself and the nation. He scraped together every available military unit, even arming university student militias, to form a defensive line on the outskirts of the capital. The Allied powers, through their representatives in Budapest, made it clear that they supported Horthy and would not tolerate Karl's return under any circumstances. Horthy was no longer just a regent. He was the designated defender of the post-war order in Central Europe. On the morning of October 23, 1921, the royalist train was halted by government troops at a small railway station in the village of Budaörs, just a few miles from the capital. This was the moment of truth. The two Hungarian armies, one loyal to its king, the other to its regent, stood facing each other. For a while, no one wanted to fire. They were not enemies. They were brothers, men who had fought side by side in the Great War, wearing the same uniform. Shouts were exchanged across the lines. Royalist officers pleaded with the government troops to join their king, but Horthy's commanders were determined. The first shots were fired. What followed was not a great pitched battle, but a confused and tragic skirmish. Karl, who was near the front line, was horrified. He had returned to unite his people, not to watch them kill each other. He repeatedly gave orders to avoid bloodshed, to try and negotiate, but it was too late. The fighting, though sporadic, was real. Men were falling, killed by their own countrymen. It soon became clear that the royalist cause was hopeless. Their forces were smaller, less organized, and running low on ammunition. Horthy's troops, defending the capital, were in a much stronger position. By the end of the day, Karl's commanders came to him with the grim news: the advance had failed. To continue the fight would be to start a full-scale civil war, a bloodbath that would tear the nation apart and invite foreign invasion. For Karl, it was the most agonizing moment of his life. He had come so close, but his conscience, the very thing that drove him, would not allow him to be the cause of a Hungarian civil war. With a heavy heart, he gave the order to surrender. The second and last attempt at restoration was over. It had ended not in a palace, but in the smoke and confusion of a muddy field, amidst the bodies of the very people he had sworn to protect. This time there was no respectful farewell, no kneeling regent. Karl and Zita were taken as prisoners, held under guard in a monastery. Their fate was no longer in their own hands, or even in Horthy's. It was now in the hands of the Allied powers. They had become international embarrassments, dangerous relics of a bygone age who had twice threatened the stability of the new Europe. The Allies were determined that there would be no third attempt. On November 1st, 1921, Karl and Zita were handed over to the British. They were taken down the Danube River on a Hungarian gunboat and then transferred to a British warship, the HMS Glowworm. As they sailed down the river, passing the ancient Hungarian capital of Esztergom, the church bells tolled in a final mournful salute to their last king and queen. They did not know where they were being taken. They were prisoners, sailing into an unknown and final exile. The destination chosen by the Allies was the remote, isolated Portuguese island of Madeira, far out in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a place of stunning natural beauty, but for them, it was a prison without bars, a place from which there could be no escape. They arrived in mid-November with nothing but a few suitcases. Their personal fortune had been confiscated. They were penniless, stateless, and utterly defeated. They were housed in a villa in the hills above the main town of Funchal. It was a damp, cold house, ill-suited for the winter months. Zita, still pregnant, tried to make a home for her husband and the children, who were allowed to join them a few months later. But the emotional and physical toll on Karl was immense. He had lost his empire, his army, his kingdom, his home, and his fortune. All he had left was his faith and his family. He spent his days in quiet prayer, teaching his children and taking long walks. In March 1922, on one of these walks, he was caught in a cold rain and developed a chill. It quickly turned into pneumonia. In their impoverished state, proper medical care was difficult to obtain. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Zita nursed him tirelessly, but his body, weakened by years of stress and heartbreak, could not fight off the infection. On April 1st, 1922, with Zita at his side, Emperor Karl I of Austria, Apostolic King Karl IV of Hungary, breathed his last. Empress Zita would later recall that his final whispered words to her were, "I must suffer so much so that my peoples can come together again." He was only 34 years old. The last Habsburg ruler died not in a palace surrounded by his court, but in a borrowed bed on a remote island, a king of nothing, an emperor of memories. Karl's story is a profound and poignant tragedy. He was perhaps the noblest and most well-intentioned of the Habsburgs, but he was also the most unfortunate. He was a man of peace forced to preside over a catastrophic war, a reformer who inherited a system that was beyond reform, a man of conscience in a world governed by brute force. His critics see him as a naive and incompetent ruler, a political amateur whose stubborn idealism only made a bad situation worse. His supporters, and the Catholic Church, which beatified him in 2004, see him as a saintly figure, a martyr for peace and Christian leadership who was crushed by the cynicism of his era. Perhaps the truth is that he was simply the wrong man, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. He was a decent, gentle man in an indecent, brutal age. His life is a powerful reminder of how individual virtue can be utterly powerless against the great, impersonal tides of history. His wife Zita would outlive him by 67 years. She never remarried, wearing mourning black for the rest of her life, a living monument to her husband and their lost world. She raised their 8 children, instilling in them a deep sense of their heritage and their father's legacy. She was finally allowed to return to Austria in 1982, and when she died in 1989 at the age of 96, her funeral in Vienna was a final ghostly echo of an imperial past attended by thousands. The story of Karl and Zita is not just a footnote in the history of the First World War. It is a deeply human story about faith, love, duty, and catastrophic failure. It marks the definitive end of an era, the moment when the 1,000-year-old dream of a universal Christian empire in the heart of Europe finally died, leaving behind a legacy of unresolved conflicts and a poignant memory of the last emperor, a good man who inherited a whirlwind and was swept away to die in lonely exile.